Photography gets really easy when you understand that every single shot has one single primary camera setting. And that primary setting can only be either aperture or shutter speed, so only one of two settings. In the last few lessons you heard a lot about image brightness and exposure, as well as how all the camera settings and scene brightness need to collaborate to create a well-exposed image. But what are the correct settings and how do you best go about shooting an image? That is much easier than you may think. When taking images, you always need to ask yourself two questions. The first one is there some action in your shot that you either want to freeze or blur? Actions that you want to freeze can be sports, flying birds, playing kids, but also, for example, grass and branches moving in the wind that you don't want to become blurry. Actions that you want to blur could be light trails, fireworks, water, and other cool stuff. If the answer to that question is yes, your primary camera setting is always shutter speed, or as you surely remember its correct term, exposure time. Because if you set it incorrectly, your image will either be blurred even though you want it to freeze motion, or sharp when you actually want it to blur motion. But which is the correct shutter speed? I'm sure that sounds intimidating, but if you've enrolled to the very affordable WOFE method tools that accompany this course on wolfarmory.com, you have already downloaded my shutter speed cheat sheet. And also my completely free exposure bars cheat sheet from last lesson has some symbols that help you decide which shutter speed to choose. And it is even available as a t-shirt, the wearable cheat sheet, but more on that at the end of the video. So it is much easier than you might expect. Just set the shutter speed that I listed and you can't go wrong. But how do you actually set shutter speed without getting an image that is too dark or too bright? Time for another example. Let's say we want to photograph a horse race. We want to freeze the motion, so shutter speed is our primary camera setting. You first need to set the exposure mode. There are two modes that let you choose shutter speed. The first one is so-called shutter priority. It is labeled with S for shutter on most cameras. Canon labels it TV for time value. Kudos to Canon for giving it the correct term. Okay, but which shutter speed should I choose? Let's have a look at the cheat sheet. It doesn't show running horses, but running dogs. That's pretty similar. You could basically say these symbols stand for fast actions of humans and animals. So we will set 1/2000th of a second shutter speed. We do that using the dials of your camera. The aperture is then supposed to automatically cooperate with the chosen shutter speed and create a well-exposed image. But let's see where that gets us. What? The image is way too dark. Isn't the camera supposed to set the correct image brightness? First of all, let me show you something. The aperture on my display is blinking, so there is something wrong. That's because the aperture is set to the lowest aperture number this lens supports. So we simply can't make aperture any brighter. So if we need that shutter speed and we can't open the aperture any further either, we depend on ISO to brighten the image. By default, ISO is often set to 100, which is no gain at all. That obviously isn't enough. There are two options how to change that. The first option is to set ISO to auto. When we do that, everything will be done automatically. So we set the shutter speed and the camera will automatically choose aperture and ISO to give us an image with the correct image brightness. Pretty convenient. The second option for setting ISO is setting it manually. What? I don't want to set anything manually. Don't worry, especially in this case it is super easy. Just change ISO step by step until the aperture stops blinking. Okay, don't tell me that was difficult. Take your camera and try it. It's a piece of cake. That was shutter priority, S, or respectively TV. The second exposure mode that would let you set shutter speed is manual exposure. Sounds intimidating, despite actually being pretty simple, but we will get to that later. What I want to discuss first, what if the answer to the question, is there some action in the shot that you want to either freeze or blur, with no? Well then, shutter speed is not your primary camera setting, and that only leaves one other option for your primary camera setting, aperture. So the second question you need to ask yourself when your answer to the first question is no is, do you want a big or a shallow depth of focus in your shot? So now aperture is your primary camera setting. Let's have a look at my exposure bar cheat sheet. You want a shallow depth of focus when you want to blur the background, for example in portraits. You want a slightly bigger depth of focus when you're shooting sports. Due to the movement, the focus might not always be perfectly accurate, so a slightly bigger aperture number helps with having a bigger depth of focus. Don't go too high either, because that will eat light that you need for a fast shutter speed. An exception would be if you have a camera and a lens with a very fast and reliable focus. In that case, you don't need to play safe, but can use the lowest aperture number available. We will get to focus in the next lesson though, so stay tuned. In a group portrait, people often don't line up perfectly and you want both the people in front and the people in the back sharp, so you raise the aperture even more. In a landscape shot, you want to get a rather big depth of focus with the foreground and the background sharp. Plus, you want to get the maximum overall sharpness, which usually is around f8 to f11. Remember, above that an effect called diffraction kicks in and makes your images increasingly soft. That's what the big 8 stands for. And finally, you want a really big depth of focus for macro shots, when diffraction can be an issue, but depth of focus might be even more important. So, all the info is in this simple cheat sheet. How do you set aperture? Let's create another real-life shot. We are going to photograph this beautiful skyline during daylight. To water your mouth, we will also photograph it in the so-called blue hour later in the course, but for now, let's stick to daylight. Technically, a cityscape is a landscape shot. Landscape? Let's check out cheat sheet. Ideally, we need f8 to f11. We set the camera to aperture priority, set f11, and the shutter speed will be set automatically to give us a well-exposed image. That was pretty easy, right? But will that always give us such a perfect image? Let's take another shot. I went up the hill to photograph the same scene from a different perspective. This time after sunset, when there is much less light. The camera is still set to aperture priority. Let's take a test shot. What in the world? The image is totally blurry. Why is that? Before I answer that question, let me once again remind you that repeating is probably the most important component of learning. This lesson 6 deals with the one part of photography that is the most difficult one to comprehend, and I feel you might be close to giving up because it seems overwhelming. But trust me, nobody has ever really understood photography by watching any video once. That simply doesn't work. You absolutely need to watch every single video of this course 3 times to understand what I'm talking about and store the information in your long-term memory. If you haven't done that yet, it's natural that you're overwhelmed. Learning means repeating, for kids just as much as for adults. I swear, when you repeat this lesson tomorrow, it will all of a sudden make much more sense. And when you rewatch it the day after tomorrow, you will wonder why you didn't understand it in the first run. That's just how our human brain works. So if you haven't done that yet, take your calendar and set a reminder for tomorrow. I just wanted to throw that in to make you aware that your current confusion is normal. But let's continue with our blurry landscape shot. Why is it blurry? The problem is, while one camera setting is always the primary camera setting, it doesn't mean that you can ignore the other, particularly when the light levels get low. If you have a look at my cheat sheet, you see that all the symbols in the aperture bar appear twice, in the aperture bar and in the shutter speed bar. And while aperture is still our primary camera setting, and therefore the one we usually don't want to make compromises with, we must not completely forget about shutter speed, because that is where things can potentially go completely wrong. Let me check the shutter speed the camera chose for our image. It is 1/6 of a second. And now let's have a look at our cheat sheet again. Let me draw your attention to that orange 1/x with a footnote. If you handhold your camera rather than put it on a tripod and use a shutter speed that is slower than 1 over the focal length you're using, chances are that you will shake the camera while pressing the shutter, and that would create motion blur. Because now it is not your subject that is moving like I did in lesson 3, but rather the camera. The result is the same though, motion blur. This time the complete image is blurry. What options do we have? Well, first and foremost, I could use a tripod. In that case, I wouldn't have to change any of the settings because the tripod would keep me from shaking the camera. But what if you don't have a tripod? Now it's time for some networked thinking. I told you in the last lesson that aperture, shutter speed and ISO are interchangeable when it comes to image brightness. If I want a faster shutter speed, I could, for example, raise ISO. If I do that, the image will not become brighter because the camera tries to keep the same brightness. In order to achieve that, it compensates the added gain with a shorter exposure time, or faster shutter speed as we photographers weirdly call it. So raising ISO is the second option after using a tripod. But that again would mean that I get more noise due to the higher ISO. That's totally fine if you really need it, but let's see if we can avoid it. So let me undo that. The third option is that I could make a different compromise and say, okay, I can live with a low aperture number, f8 should be enough. If I set that instead of f11, we also see that the camera will choose a faster shutter speed to compensate for the additional amount of light that will enter the camera if I block less light. Remember, lower number, less light is blocked. Back to setting our camera. I'm using a focal length of 28mm, so I need an even faster shutter speed. That means I have to make even more compromises because I need a shutter speed of at least 1/28th of a second. If you look at the cheat sheet, 1/28th isn't even available, so I have to use the next fastest shutter speed, which is 1/30th of a second. If I try to get there by lowering the aperture number, I would have to go as low as f5. If you don't want to go that low, you can also split the compensation. So you could, for example, lower the aperture by 2 clicks to get to 1/20th of a second, and then raise ISO 2 clicks to ISO 160 to finally get the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second. What you again see is that you are hugely dependent on the amount of light you have available. Shots that are easy in bright daylight can become pretty tricky when the light levels get low. However, I'm sure you agree that it is a pretty cumbersome workflow when you need to adjust a different setting in order to make the camera change the one setting that you actually want to address. And that is why many photographers feel that shooting in manual exposure is actually easier because you get direct access to all 3 brightness settings. Let me show you how easy it really is using the example of our landscape shot. Let's start from scratch again. First, I changed to manual exposure. Are you nervous? No need to be nervous. Trust me, this is going to be easy. Our primary camera setting is still aperture, so we set f11. Please note that neither shutter speed nor ISO are changed to compensate for the loss of light the higher f number causes. We are in manual exposure, so we are in charge, not the camera. We do know that we don't want motion blur in our handheld shot, so we know that we must not go below 1 over focal length. I'm still using a 28mm lens, so I must not go below 1/30th of a second. We leave ISO at 100 because we want a noise-free image. Now, how can we check if that gives us a well-exposed image? We could take a test shot, but we don't even need to do that. Every camera displays a great little helper, the exposure meter. It is either displayed as a bar or as a simple decimal number. And what a coincidence, it again has increments of thirds. So -1/3 is 1 click underexposed. 3 clicks is 1 stop, so -1 is 3 clicks or 1 stop underexposed. If the image would come out more than 2 stops underexposed, the camera would display an error or the decimal would be blinking. So if we take a look at the meter, we see that the image would turn out way underexposed. To change that, we need to make it brighter. We will leave shutter speed as is because we don't want motion blur. Let's start by changing aperture. Let's say we can live with an aperture of f8. That's 1, 2, 3 clicks or 1 stop. While we set that, we saw that the exposure meter changed from more than 2 stops underexposed to -1 and 1/3 stop. We are still 4 clicks underexposed though. Remember, 1/3 is 1 click. So we have to raise the gain, or in other words ISO, by those 4 clicks to get the exposure meter to 0. We end up at ISO 250. Let's practice a bit more with manual exposure. What if I had a tripod and could basically use any shutter speed I wanted without shaking the camera? Pretty easy. First I would set ISO to the base level to get the least amount of noise. Then I would set the aperture to the best possible setting, f11. And now I can just play with shutter speed until the exposure meter is at 0. Don't tell me that was more difficult than fiddling around in aperture or shutter priority. One thing I hope you understand right away is just because you can manually adjust each setting individually doesn't mean you can set anything you want. The base of it all is still light, so the brightness of the scene you're photographing, or in other words, scene luminance. If the light gets low, you almost always have to make compromises, very often even in bright daylight. Now, is manual exposure always the best idea? Not at all. Don't let anyone tell you that. But if you need control over more than one setting for whatever reason, it is the fastest and easiest way. Plus, you sometimes avoid errors because you're more thoughtful about each individual setting. However, if you need to be fast, for example during a wedding when conditions change quickly when moving from indoors to outdoors, aperture or shutter priority along with auto ISO do help you to make sure that you don't miss important moments. Since I don't expect that this is the first video of the course that you're watching, you're probably not surprised that I have a drill training for you that will store choosing the right camera mode into muscle memory. And beside that, speed up setting aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Yes, that's what the Wolf Method tools are all about. Speed up your photography learning curve big time. Either way, what will help you with the camera settings, no matter if manual exposure, aperture priority or shutter priority, is my wearable cheat sheet. Check out the link in the description if you want to get the best cheat sheet for photography as a t-shirt. We have one very important information left in regard to exposure, but to give you a bit of a break from exposure, we will deal with something even more exciting. Focus! In the next video.